Hi, welcome to Popcorn Philosophy. In this video, I want to answer one of the big questions. What is art? Okay, maybe that's too big. Let's narrow it down a little bit. Is this art? But before we go too far, let's take a step back and look at some examples just to get in the right headspace. So you wouldn't really see anyone claiming that this or this isn't art. We can usually agree those are art. Similarly, most people would agree that this is art. But show enough people this piece, and you're likely to get some rolled eyes. We'll come back to this one. Let's look at this piece, which was made by Claes Oldenburg and sits outside the St. Louis Museum of Art. Is this piece art? This one seems pretty easy. It's outside the museum, but it's close enough and it's got a plaque, so we can be pretty sure it's art, right? I think most people would agree that this is art. But what if we shrunk it down a little bit? Changed the shape a little, changed its color? Is it still art? If you're inclined to say no, take the Mona Lisa, which is infamous for being smaller than expected. If you shrunk that down, would it still be art? Now, if we're sure that the Mona Lisa is art, but we have some doubts about this plug, why is that? Let's make some obvious statements. Number one, art is at least as old as civilization. And number two, we live in a society. The question about whether something qualifies as art seems to really only be asked regarding modern art, which is an umbrella term that seems to encapsulate everything post-Van Gogh. A common reaction that I've seen to a lot of modern art pieces is the statement, "Oh, I could do that." Now, I think this statement is really interesting for a few reasons. First, people usually use it as a way to invalidate the object that they're referring to as a piece of art. And they do this as opposed to using that statement as a way of validating themselves as an artist. See the difference? In all likelihood, yes, you probably could make something like that. Now, go make some art. This statement also gets at an assumption that a lot of people are making about art, usually without realizing it, which is that they think that making art requires some technical skill, which is not to say that everything that requires technical skill is art, but a lot of people seem to think that making art necessarily requires some technique. Now, this gets at the inherent difficulty involved in deciding whether this piece is art. You probably had an immediate negative reaction to my proposal that it might be art. But if it's not art, why not? So in order to definitively answer this question, we need to create and agree on a definition of art. Now, as I see it, there are three main difficulties with creating this definition of art. When forming a definition of art with the express purpose of deciding what goes in the bucket and what goes outside of the bucket, we're already making an assumption about what the purpose of a definition is. We are already seeing a definition as a way to put up borders around a thing, as opposed to, for example, seeing a definition as a referent, a way of pointing at a thing. But let's not get too sidetracked here. Let's assume for now that the purpose of a definition is to decide what goes inside the bucket and what goes outside of the bucket. So in order to do this for art, we need to create a definition that includes everything that is art and excludes everything that isn't art. But in order to do this, we already need to know what goes in the bucket. In other words, we already need to have an idea about what art is. So we're stuck in this circular process. This task is made doubly difficult by the fact that language is rarely precise enough to actually do this work. Michel Duchamp, whose urinal we looked at earlier, demonstrated this difficulty when he submitted his urinal for consideration to the Society of Independent Artists under the name The Fountain, using the pseudonym R. Mutt. His submission was rejected, and it became a divisive issue in the art community. An anonymous editorial said, quote, "Whether Mr. Mutt with his own hands made the fountain or not has no importance. He chose it. He took an ordinary article of life, placed it so that its useful significance disappeared under the new title and point of view, created a new thought for that object." Now, this statement challenges another preconception that we have about art. It seems pretty uncomplicated to state that the artist should make the art. But here we see this pretty basic idea thrown into doubt. So we see here that some of these preconceptions that we have about art, which we need in order to create our definition of art, can be thrown into doubt. The second issue is that defining things can sometimes be fraught. What do I mean by that? Well, I'm glad you asked. When someone insists on a definition for something, especially when they're using it primarily as a means of exclusion, I think we need to be careful to examine that person's motive. Now, there's a Twitter thread that I want to share with you that perfectly captures both of these difficulties so far. Both how difficult it is to use language to define something, and how the motivations of people who are seeking to use definitions in an exclusionary manner can be questionable at best. Now, this Twitter thread is from a while ago, but this record of it has it as being from 1 day ago. Now, this is an exchange between Glinner, who is a notorious transphobe who was recently correctly banned from Twitter for his actions, not those specifically in this thread, for other things that he did, and a few other people, and it gets at the difficulties that we talked about. So, first we see Glinner saying, "Women might like to know that there are a significant number of woke dudes who think this is true. There is no definition of woman." To which Avery responds, "Could you define chair for me in a way that it includes all things which are chairs and excludes all things which aren't? This is what we were trying to do with art." To which he replies, "A separate seat for one person, typically with a back and 4 legs." Now, at this point, he thinks he's won. Aha, I have defined chair. But then we have this brilliant response. And this is a separate seat for one person, typically with a back and 4 legs. Okay, so let's move on to the final issue with creating a definition of art, which is that definitions are just not how we interact with the world. Let's look at an example. Aha, I see before me a protrusion around waist height in this thing I have previously established to be a door. Since these phenomena combine to match the thing I have defined as doorknob, I will therefore perform the implied action. That would be absolutely ridiculous. Instead, what happens is, I want to go to whatever is behind that door, and I know how to operate a doorknob. So I do it. Similarly, when confronted with a piece of art, we would not say, "Aha, I am being presented with a phenomenon mounted on a wall. Since I have established myself to be within an art museum, I can conjecture that I am supposed to take this, too, as a piece of art. Having established this, let me now refer to my pre-configured definition of art, in order to ascertain whether this piece fits within the boundaries I have set." Again, ridiculous. Instead, when we're confronted with a piece of art, we have a reaction to it. We see it, and we respond. Maybe we have an emotional response. Maybe the art triggers a memory that we have. I think it's important to talk about art in the way that we experience it, which is not this clinical, definitional way. So let's return to our giant plug outside the St. Louis Art Museum. I want to talk about my reaction to it. When I saw this piece, I was reminded of Horizon Zero Dawn, which is a game set in the far distant future. Specifically, it reminded me of those scenes where you encounter broken down remnants of our modern world. Now, obviously, that's not what Oldenburg had in mind when he made this piece in the 20th century. But after seeing this, I looked at the plaque for the piece of art, and it had the phrase, "An implement left over from a war, returning to nature." Now, this is interesting because what he was evoking in the piece is similar to the reaction that I had to it. The difference being that I brought my own experiences playing Horizon Zero Dawn to the piece. So it's not the reaction that he meant, but it's the one that I had. I saw the art, I had a reaction, and I formed a sort of relationship with it. So if that plug is art, is this plug art? You probably had some sort of reaction when I proposed that this might be art. Is that enough to make it art? Is just suggesting something might be art enough to make it art? What do you think? Can we create a definition of art? If we can't create a definition of art, does that mean that everything is art? Let me know what you think in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting that like button or subscribing or doing both. And I'll be back with another video in 2 weeks' time.